The door slammed shut in her face. It wasn't the first time, not the second either. It was the 10th time that day. The sound of the wood striking echoed louder than any insult, because by now, no words were needed. In Copper Springs, even silence knew how to reject. Ada Redhawk stood still for a moment, her hand still raised as if the door might change its mind and open again. It didn't. Behind her, 5-year-old Kaya lowered her gaze to the dusty ground. Her tiny fingers clung tightly to her mother's skirt, with a grip that didn't match her age. Eli, barely 3, didn't understand why they kept walking, or why everyone seemed to look at them with suspicion. "Mom," Kaya whispered, "I'm hungry." Ada clenched her jaw. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had no words that wouldn't break her apart inside. They had arrived in Copper Springs 3 days ago, after nearly 2 weeks walking from the Apache lands. Ada had heard things on the road. Rumors that this town always needed labor, that ranches were hiring strong hands, that it was a place where even those who'd lost everything could start again. No one told her those opportunities already belonged to someone. That forgiveness and mercy weren't handed out evenly. Since her husband's death on a hunting trip, falling off a ridge before he even had a chance to say goodbye, Ada had learned to carry grief in silence. She didn't get the luxury of mourning. She had 2 children, and the world doesn't stop for a widowed Apache woman. She knew how to work. More than anyone in that town could imagine. She could tan hides, sew weatherproof clothes, raise horses from wild colts, identify healing herbs, and tend wounds others called hopeless. Her hands were strong, hardened by sun and necessity, her will even stronger. But Copper Springs didn't see that. They saw her skin. They heard the mixed tongue her children used when they spoke. They noticed the small feathers braided discreetly into her dark hair. To them, Ada wasn't a mother. She was a problem. "We don't want your kind here," the owner of a boarding house had snapped, slamming the window shut. "Get out of town." Your kind. Last night, they'd slept in a blacksmith's barn, hiding from the cold wind amid the smell of hay and livestock. At dawn, the man had discovered them and shouted them out. "If the sheriff finds out I let Indians sleep here, I'll lose my business." That word, Indians, hit Ada like a stone to the chest. She didn't answer. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when Eli's stomach growled every hour. The sun was starting to set when a rough voice called to her from the general store's porch. "Apache woman." Ada turned slowly. The store owner, a heavyset man with a gray mustache, looked at her like she was something blown in by desert wind. "I'll give you food," he said, holding out a small sack. "But take it and leave by dawn. We don't want trouble here. This ain't charity. It's a warning." Ada took the sack without a word. She lowered her head, not from shame, but to hide the tremble in her eyes. Kaya looked up at her, confused. Eli clung to her leg. They walked to the edge of town, where an old abandoned barn offered something close to shelter. That night, with her children curled against her on dry straw, Ada cried in silence. Not for herself. Never for herself. She cried for Kaya, for Eli, for a world that judged 2 children before giving them a chance to be anything more than what others chose to see. "The world is hard," her husband used to say, "but we're harder. We've got warrior blood." But that night, Ada didn't feel like a warrior. She felt fragile, like the dry leaves crackling beneath her tired back. Dawn came wrapped in fog. The sound of hooves startled her awake. Her heart raced. She thought they'd come to drive them out even from this forgotten place. But when she peeked through the barn's broken boards, she saw something different. A tall man was dismounting slowly from his horse. He looked like a working cowboy. Worn hat, dust-stained clothes, boots tired from long miles. No visible weapons. He removed his hat before approaching, as if not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady but calm. "Name's Zeke Callahan. I need to speak with you." Ada rose instantly, placing herself between him and her children. Her fingers instinctively searched for a broken piece of wood, anything she could use to protect them. "I mean you no harm," he added, raising both hands. "I saw you in town yesterday, saw how they treated you, and I think maybe we can help each other." Ada studied him in silence. There was no pity in his eyes. There was weariness. And something else. Something she recognized instantly. The same loneliness that had followed her each night since she'd lost everything. Fate, silent and patient, had just opened a different kind of door. And Ada didn't yet know if she was ready to walk through it. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope on the verge of snapping. Ada Redhawk didn't lower the piece of wood gripped in her hand. The dawn hadn't yet warmed the air, and fog wrapped around the barn like it was trying to hide them from the world. Zeke Callahan didn't move. He respected the space, didn't take another step. Life had taught him the hard way that some wounds don't get approached. They get waited on. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said finally. "Not pity either, just a solution." Ada looked him over. A cowboy, yes. That much was plain. But not the kind who strutted through town with clean boots and soft hands. He was one of the saddle-worn ones, the kind who lived with dust in his throat and miles in his bones. His clothes were faded, the brim of his hat bent by sun. And his hands, those hands spoke of work that didn't end when the sun went down. "What do you want?" she asked, voice firm, not a trace of gratitude yet. Zeke took a breath before replying. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles from here. Not big, but it holds together. Been cowboying since I could walk. And for the past year," he paused. "Past year I've been a widower." The words hung there. Ada didn't react. She knew he wasn't looking for sympathy. She could see that clear. "I've got 2 kids," Zeke went on. "Lila, she's 7. Jace, he's 5. Since their mama passed, I've done what I can. But the ranch is too much. And the kids, they need more than I can give 'em alone." Ada pressed her lips together. Behind her, Kaya stirred in the straw, waking slow. Eli whimpered softly, still half asleep. "And what does that have to do with me?" Ada asked. "The town already made it real clear they don't want me here." Zeke nodded slowly. "Exactly. You need a place where no one's going to throw you out. I need help. Honest work. A roof, meals, and a small wage. I can't offer luxury, but I can offer respect." Respect. That word hit Ada harder than any slammed door. Still, she didn't lower her guard. "My children eat first," she said bluntly. "Always. If there's not much, they eat before me. And before yours." Zeke didn't hesitate. "Agreed. I won't tolerate insults toward my people or our ways. If anyone on your ranch disrespects me, I leave. If you disrespect me—" She looked him straight in the eyes. "You won't see me again." "Understood. And I won't work just for food and shelter. I need money. Not much, but real. I have to think about my children's future." Zeke rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "I can pay weekly. It won't be much at first, but once the harvest picks up, it'll be more." Ada fell silent. She studied that tired but steady face. She didn't see lies. Didn't see pity either. She saw something more dangerous. Honest desperation. "Why?" she asked then. Why risk the town turning on you over an Apache woman and 2 kids? Zeke crouched down slowly until he was level with Kaya, who watched him with quiet curiosity. Because when my wife died, he said softly, no one came to help me. Folks said they were sorry, then went on with their lives. I had to bury her alone. Had to get back to work the next morning, 'cause animals don't wait for grief. He stood and met Ada's eyes with brutal honesty. I saw how they treated you yesterday, saw the same loneliness I've carried for a year now, and I thought, maybe 2 lonely people can hold each other up without sinking. This isn't charity, it's survival. Eli began to cry, fully waking. Ada picked him up immediately, rocking him gently. She looked at Zeke one last time. When would I start? A shadow of relief passed over the cowboy's face. Right now if you want. My wagon's outside. Half an hour later, they were rolling down the dusty road, leaving Copper Springs behind. Kaya and Eli slept beneath a thick blanket Zeke had brought along. The town faded into the distance, shrinking with each mile. How did your wife die? Ada asked, breaking the silence. Zeke tightened his grip on the reins. Fever. Came on quick. By the next night, she wasn't breathing. Ada nodded slowly. At least she didn't suffer long. Small comforts, he murmured. The ranch appeared after a bend in the road. It wasn't fancy, but it looked solid. Alive. A wooden house, a red barn, corrals, and open fields under a vast sky. Zeke pulled the wagon to a stop. Welcome, he said. Starting today, there's 6 of us. Ada stepped down with Eli in her arms. Kaya followed behind. She took a deep breath. She didn't know if it would work. But for the first time since her husband died, fear wasn't walking alone. The creak of the hinges was the first sound Ada heard when Zeke pushed open the heavy wooden door. The house smelled of old dust and dry wood, the kind of scent that still held the memory of home, though not yet healed. Kaya squeezed her hand tightly. Eli, nestled in her other arm, breathed deeply, lulled by the journey. Zeke turned toward them. It ain't much, but it's clean, and it's safe, he said, placing his hat on a chair. The house had a main room with a cast-iron stove, a pair of worn armchairs, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, and a faded rug that had once been red. To the right, a narrow hallway led to the bedrooms. It was modest, but honest. You can stay here, in this room, Zeke added, opening the back door. It gets good morning light. Ada stepped inside and saw 2 small beds with folded sheets and a window overlooking the corral. It was clear the room had been prepared in a hurry. An attempt, a gesture. That was enough. Thank you, she murmured, still not letting her guard down. When they stepped back into the main room, they found Zeke's 2 children waiting. Lila, her blonde braids loose and eyes full of doubt, sat with her arms crossed. Jace, younger, hid behind a chair, peeking at Kaya through the slats. Neither of them said a word. Ada gave a slight nod in greeting. Kaya, always the brave one, stepped forward. Hi. Silence. Zeke cleared his throat, uneasy. Lila, Jace, this is Ada, and these are Kaya and Eli. They'll be living with us from now on. Lila pressed her lips together. Why? Because, he replied without raising his voice, in this house, we don't leave folks behind. Dinner was tense. Ada had made a simple stew with beans, onion, a bit of salted meat, and spices she carried with her. The smell was strong, different from what the children were used to. What is this? Lila asked, wrinkling her nose. Hot food, Ada replied without looking. Smells weird. Well, be glad it don't smell like hunger. Zeke froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. Lila stared at Ada, offended. But Jace, curious, took a bite and didn't say a word. Just kept eating, faster with every spoonful. "It's good," he whispered. Ada didn't smile, but Kaya did. And that was enough. After dinner, while Zeke was drawing water from the well, Ada began tidying the kitchen without being asked. Kaya helped, wiping the table with a damp cloth. Lila watched everything from the doorway, her arms still crossed. "We're not like you," she said suddenly. "We don't need you coming in here and changing everything." Ada looked at her but didn't stop what she was doing. "I didn't come to be like you," she answered. "I came to stay alive." Lila bit her lip and ran off toward the barn. That night, as the sky filled with stars and the moon lit up the fields like they were silver, Ada tucked in her children and then stepped out onto the porch. She sat in silence, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Zeke appeared with a cup of coffee in hand. He offered her one. She took it without a word. "It's not easy on them," he said after a while. "Lila thinks letting someone else in means forgetting her mother." Ada looked out at the horizon, wide and dark. "The heart can hold more than one kind of hurt," she whispered, "and more than one kind of love, too." Zeke nodded, like her words had lodged somewhere deep in his chest. "You did good today," he added. "Thanks for not giving up." Ada didn't respond. She didn't need to. Sometimes gratitude is spoken in the quiet between two people who, though wounded, have chosen to keep going. And that night, under the desert stars, a new home began to beat, though no one knew it yet. The sun hadn't risen when Ada got up. The dawn air was sharp, and the wood floor creaked beneath her quiet steps. With precise movements and no sound, she wrapped the wool shawl Zeke had loaned her over her shoulders and stepped out into the corral. The horses snorted through the fog. The sky had only just begun to lighten when she started gathering water buckets and checking the feed troughs. She didn't ask what needed doing. She didn't wait for orders. She just watched, thought, and acted. Because in her life, no one had ever handed her the right to wait. By the time the rooster crowed, the chicken coop was clean, coffee bubbled on the stove, and the scent of cornbread was starting to feel like home. Zeke found her there, stirring the pot with one hand while holding a sleeping Eli in the other. "You didn't have to do all this so early," he said, voice rough from too little sleep. "If it don't get done at this hour, it don't get done right," Ada answered without turning. Zeke didn't push it. He just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in silence. There was something in the way she moved, in how she took space without claiming it, that settled him. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like everything rested only on him. The children came down one by one. Lila was first, still frowning from the night before. But when she saw the warm bread and the meal laid out, she froze, like she didn't know whether to be grateful or suspicious. Jace, on the other hand, dove right into his plate, hungry and grinning. Kaya shared her spoon with her little brother, teaching him not to spill. And in that simple kitchen, for a few minutes, the world worked. Later, Ada spent the day tending to what the house had forgotten. She washed curtains, beat dust from old rugs, mended torn sheets, and gathered wild herbs near the creek. With each gesture, she left an invisible mark, a quiet sign that she was here. She didn't want to take over. She just wanted to belong. By dusk, shouting erupted from the barn. "Jace fell!" Lila cried, racing in with wide, terrified eyes. Ada didn't hesitate. She ran to the stable, heart pounding in her chest. She found the boy on the dirt floor, his leg bent at an odd angle, tears flowing uncontrollably. "Don't touch him," she ordered firmly. She knelt beside him, took his hand, and spoke gently. Breathe, little one. Look at me. I'm here." With calm but sure hands, she examined the leg. It wasn't broken, but it was badly twisted. It had to be set before swelling took hold. Zeke arrived just then. "What happened?" "Bad sprain. I need clean cloth, hot water, and a straight stick." Zeke didn't ask anything else. He obeyed. Lila held her breath, pale. She'd never seen her father take orders from anyone. Ada worked with care. She mixed a herbal paste from crushed leaves she carried in her leather pouch, applied it gently to Jace's skin, and braced the leg with the most precise splint Zeke had ever seen. "My grandmother was a healer," Ada said without looking up. "She taught me how to see past the pain." When she finished, she stroked Jace's hair. He'd stopped crying. "You're strong," she whispered, "like a mountain colt." That night, the air in the house felt different. Lila approached Ada as she washed cloths in the basin out on the porch. "Thanks," she said softly, "for helping Jace." Ada didn't answer right away. She just wrung out the fabric with steady hands. "When you save a child," she said at last, "you don't just save a body, you heal an older wound." Lila dropped her gaze. After a pause, she turned and walked back inside. Zeke, leaning in the barn shadows, had heard it all. Resting against the post, he felt something inside him ease. Maybe, just maybe, this house had found its soul again. And without any of them realizing it, change had begun to take root in the quiet soil of that old ranch. That day's heat arrived without asking. From early morning, the sun scorched the fields like it meant to melt the earth. No birds sang. The horses snorted nervously. Not a single leaf stirred. Ada Redhawk felt it first on her skin. A chill that wasn't from cold, but from instinct. The air smelled different. Thicker, heavy with something still unseen. She saw it in the dogs, too, curled under the porch with their ears drooping. And in the bugs, silent all of a sudden. "There's a storm coming," she said quietly. Zeke, hammering old nails into a fence, turned to her. "A storm? The sky's clear, Ada, not a cloud in sight." "That's what makes it more dangerous." He looked at her for a few seconds. He didn't argue. Since Ada had arrived at the ranch, every warning she'd given had come true with clockwork precision. Zeke didn't understand how she knew, but he'd learned to listen. "What do we do?" he asked. "Get the hay stored. Tie down the barn doors. Bring in water and lay out blankets for the kids. And move fast." Zeke nodded. He whistled for Jace, who was playing near the well, and got to work. In less than an hour, the house turned into a hive of activity. Ada directed everything without raising her voice, with that calm authority that doesn't need to assert itself. Leela helped with the animals. Jace and Kaya gathered dry wood like it was a game. Even little Eli, with his tiny hands, did his best to carry water buckets without spilling too much. The sky began to shift. First, a brown haze on the horizon. Then, a dark line moving slowly, like it carried the weight of the whole desert behind it. The wind hit suddenly, like a whip. Dirt rose in spirals, slapping faces and stinging eyes. Zeke slammed the barn door shut just as the sand began to lash with fury. "Everyone inside!" he yelled. Inside the house, Ada lowered the wooden shutters and pushed a blanket against the cracks in the door. The storm struck with ancient fury. The wind howled like a wounded animal. Sand slipped through the cracks, ground between teeth, stuck to every patch of sweat. The house groaned but held. The children huddled together in the far corner of the room. Ada sang to them softly. An old song from her people, one that spoke of wind and fire, of fear and courage. The earth breathes, the sky speaks, but those who listen with their hearts are never lost, she recited. When it ended, the silence was so sudden it hurt. The door creaked open with effort. Zeke stepped out first. The land looked different now. Fields covered in dust, trees stripped bare, the sky still tinged yellow. But the ranch still stood. The animals were alive, and so were they. "I wouldn't have known what to do without you," he said, not turning. "You saved us." Ada came out after him, her hair wild and her eyes steady. It wasn't magic, just listening to what the land tries to tell us. That afternoon, while dust still floated in the air, they saw Judd Sloan riding up, one of the neighbors from across the valley. He was drenched in sweat, eyes full of grit, shirt torn. "Zeke," he panted, "my roof's gone. The goats are trapped in the corral and the barn won't hold another night. Can you help me?" Zeke looked at Ada, as if asking for guidance. She didn't hesitate. "Let's go. If we hurry, we'll make it before dark." Zeke, Lila, and Ada rode with Sloan to his ranch. Ada calmed the animals, improvised bandages, helped reinforce the corral with ropes. Sloan, who'd never spoken to her directly before, looked at her with a mix of respect and shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know you knew so much." "And there's a lot more you don't know," she replied, without bitterness. When they returned home that night, dirty and exhausted, the children ran out to hug her. Ada wrapped her arms around them. Zeke watched from the porch. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She wasn't just help. She was part of the ranch, part of them, and that, after the storm, was the only thing still standing. The dust still lingered in the air when the first murmurs began. The Callahan Ranch had held. The house stood. The animals were alive. The children were healthy. And all of it, folks whispered, was thanks to the Indian woman, the Apache woman. The story spread through Copper Springs like damp gunpowder, slow but unstoppable. It wasn't a secret that Zeke Callahan had taken in a strange woman and her children. What no one expected was that after the storm, they'd be the ones helping half the valley. "You see how she saved Sloan's boy?" folks said at the general store. "Found him pinned under broken boards in the corral and pulled him out like a seasoned doctor." They say she knows herbs, that she heals with plants and words from her people. They say a lot of things, and none of it good comes from having an Indian living among whites. The poison didn't just come from rough men at the saloon. The coldest looks came from the churches, the porches, and the sewing circles, places where hands wove threads while tongues unraveled kindness. One afternoon, while Zeke was selling eggs at the town market, Creed Voss, the bank owner, approached him. Dark suit, stiff-brimmed hat, hands that had never touched dirt. "Callahan," he said without greeting, "some neighbors are concerned." Zeke crossed his arms, not bothering to fake politeness. "Concerned about what?" "About what's going on at your place. An Apache woman? 2 kids that aren't yours? Folks talk. This town's not the place for social experiments." Zeke looked at him with the eyes of a man who'd stopped fearing what was never offered to him. "And since when is what happens under my roof your business?" "Since your credit depends on the bank's trust. Don't forget who keeps your harvests afloat every season." Zeke clenched his jaw. "If you came to threaten me, you should use bigger words." Creed smirked. "Just advice. That ranch needs the town's respect. Don't forget that." Zeke returned to the ranch that night, quieter than usual. Ada noticed from the doorway. She didn't ask, but he spoke anyway. "They want you gone." "I figured," she replied, without surprise. "They say you'll bring trouble, That we're dishonoring the ones who came before. Ada turned to the fields, where the sunset turned the hills gold. And what do you say? Zeke took a while to answer. I say I can't raise these kids alone, but more than that. I say I don't want to do it without you. The days that followed were tense. Some suppliers stopped coming by the ranch. Others raised their prices for no reason. In town, children started avoiding Kaya and Jace. Even Lila and Jace Callahan noticed. There was something in the air, a kind of rejection. Invisible, but sharp as barbed wire. But inside the home, Ada remained steady. She cooked, cared, sewed, and taught. In every corner of that house, her presence had become essential. One afternoon, while repairing a fence alongside Zeke, she said, I didn't come here looking for pity or protection. I came because my children needed to survive. And now we've got something worth defending. Zeke looked at her, hands full of splinters and a heart slowly clearing of doubts. Then we'll defend it together. That night, there was fresh bread on the table, children's laughter echoing through the house, and a single candle flickering against the wind pounding the windows. Outside, Copper Springs whispered. Inside, a family was being born, one that didn't ask for permission. Because in the dustiest corners of the West, love doesn't always come with flowers. Sometimes it shows up with wounds, scars, and the fierce decision not to be broken by the voices of others. Morning came with a clear sky, but the mood in Copper Springs was heavier than the air before a storm. The church bells rang out for Sunday service, same as always, but the pews no longer filled with the comfort of routine. Zeke Callahan walked down Main Street with a steady stride. He wore his work shirt, a dusty hat, and a clear gaze. He didn't bring the children, or Ada. This time, he walked alone. Because what he had to say, he would say, as a man, as a father, and as someone who had had enough. Neighbors watched from porches. Some pretended not to see him. Others lowered their gaze. A few women whispered behind their fans. In front of Boone Taggart's general store, Creed Voss stood waiting, flanked by familiar faces. Clara Vance, Judd Sloan, Roy Cutter, and others who'd never set foot on his land, but felt entitled to pass judgment. Zeke, Creed said with a dry tone. Glad you came. We needed to discuss this calmly. Then talk, Zeke answered without flinching. We don't want this getting worse. Some respectable folks in town are uncomfortable with your situation. You mean Ada? I mean an Apache woman and her children living under your roof. Like rules don't matter. Like your late wife's memory doesn't deserve respect. Zeke felt his cheeks burn, but he didn't let anger eat his words. My wife died alone in her bed, and not one of you came to see if my children had food. Not one. And now that someone's filled that house with laughter again, you come tell me how I should live? Zeke, that's not what this is about. It's exactly what this is about, he cut in. It's about prejudice. About not being able to stand the fact that a woman you don't understand has more honor and more courage than most folks standing here. A tense murmur passed through the crowd. Judd Sloan looked down. Clara Vance pressed her lips tight. And the children? What example are you giving them? A voice asked from the crowd. Zeke raised his voice for the first time. An example of dignity, that you don't judge people by their blood, but by their actions. That when someone reaches out a hand, you don't bite it. That a family isn't measured by skin color or last names. It's measured by who stays when life gets hard. Silence fell like a bucket of cold water. I'm not sending Ada away. I'm not turning my back on Kaya or Eli. I've seen them work harder than most grown men in this town. And I'll make it clear, Ada is not my servant. She's the woman who saved my children. She's part of my home. And she's staying, whether you like it or not. Creed clenched his jaw. Whatever authority he'd held was slipping through his fingers like sand. If you keep this up, the bank won't back you. No one will buy your crops. You'll be on your own." Zeke took a step forward, meeting each face. "I'd rather stand alone in truth than surrounded by hypocrisy." He turned on his heel and walked away without looking back. That night, as his horse crossed the dirt road and the house came into view between the trees, Ada waited on the porch. She didn't ask anything. Zeke dismounted and took off his hat. "I told them, all of them, who we are, who you are." Ada said nothing. She just looked at him with calm, dark eyes. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. The Callahan Ranch wasn't just a stretch of land anymore. It was a home, built on sheer will. The children came running to greet him. Kaya threw her arms around his waist. Eli laughed, not understanding but feeling everything. Zeke wrapped one arm around them, and with the other, reached for Ada's hand. That night, the ranch glowed with the quiet light of people who no longer needed to hide. Because when a man stands tall for his own, no wind or whisper can bring him down. Days passed with no one knocking on the Callahan door. The dust settled over the tracks of old disputes, but the echo of what Zeke had said in town still rumbled through households like a silent thunder. And yet, it was in that quiet where the first signs of change began to grow. The first to return was Clara Vance. One morning, as Ada stepped onto the porch, she saw her climb down from her wagon, holding a basket. Her face was tight, her steps uncertain, but the basket smelled of fresh-baked honey oat bread. This is for the children," she said, not raising her eyes. "I won't stay. Just figured maybe they haven't had something sweet in a while." Ada looked at her. Not with pride, not with resentment. She took the basket gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance." Clara nodded, lips pressed together, and turned back to her wagon. She didn't say another word. But before leaving, her eyes met Ada's for a moment. And in that look, there wasn't scorn. Maybe not yet respect, but something beginning. That same week, Judd Sloan showed up at dusk. His hat was stained with grease, his boots caked in mud. "You got that bark and lavender salve you used on the colt? One of my mules cut its leg on an old fence." Ada nodded without speaking. She walked to the shelf and handed him a small jar wrapped in cloth. "Apply it twice a day. Don't let him lick it." Judd nodded. He hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and set a few coins on the table. "It's not charity," he said. "It's fair payment." Zeke walked him to the door, and for the first time in a long while, they shook hands. Meanwhile, life on the ranch bloomed with a new rhythm. Kaya and Lila spent afternoons weaving together. At first in silence, then in whispers, and eventually in laughter. Lila was learning how to braid with colored beads. Kaya was learning to pronounce English words without fear. Jace and Eli spent hours building branch shelters behind the barn, pretending to hunt imaginary bison. When Ada called them in for supper, they came running, mud up to their ears, eyes glowing. One afternoon, Ada took all 4 children into the fields. She taught them how to recognize plants, how to read the clouds, how to walk without making a sound. "My mother used to say the earth speaks," she told them, "but only those who respect every stone and every ant can understand it." The children listened with a focus they'd never shown to any teacher. One special night, Ada baked cornbread and cooked a stew seasoned with spices she'd brought in her satchel. "What are we celebrating?" Zeke asked from the head of the table. "Nothing. And everything," Ada replied with a half-smile. That dinner was different. They laughed, shared stories. Even Lila chimed in, telling how she once thought a snake had followed her for an entire week. By the end, they were all crying from laughter. Zeke watched her from his seat, quietly. The house now smelled like home. The walls no longer felt heavy. The air was filled with warmth, not just from the stove, but from something deeper. The certainty of having found a place where one is seen and accepted. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Ada stepped out onto the porch. Zeke followed, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Never thought something like this could happen again," he said. "Like what?" Laughter. Feeling whole. Ada didn't answer, but she reached for his hand. The touch was gentle, but firm, like the first root breaking through dry ground, refusing to let go. In the darkness, the ranch breathed in peace. And in the quiet shadows of the desert, hope had planted its first seeds. Spring arrived at the ranch without a sound. The first wildflowers peeked through the dry grass, as if they too were learning to trust the earth again. Birds returned little by little. The air softened. Zeke Callahan had carried something in his chest for days, a knot he didn't quite know how to untie. It wasn't fear. It was respect. And something deeper. Since that night of laughter around the table, Ada hadn't just been part of the home. She had become its center. That afternoon, after distributing feed and shutting the corral, Zeke stood at the threshold of the house. Ada was weaving on the porch while Kaya picked wildflowers, and Jace chased Eli with a stick, pretending it was a sword. Lila watched from the window, wearing a quiet smile. Zeke took off his hat, turned it slowly in his hands, and walked towards the porch. The sky was painted orange. Everything smelled of damp earth and firewood. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Ada nodded, never stopping the rhythm of her fingers through the thread. Zeke sat beside her, staring out at the horizon with a straight back. It took him a while to speak. "I've been thinking a lot lately about all this, about what we are." Ada glanced sideways. "And what are we, Zeke?" He swallowed hard. "At first you came here because you didn't have a choice. We were both wounded, both just trying to survive. But over time, you didn't just bring order to this house or care for my kids. You brought calm to my soul. You brought warmth to these walls. And you gave back something I thought I'd buried with Sarah, hope." Ada rested her weaving on her lap. Her face, as always, was composed, but her eyes sparkled. "Sarah was your wife. I'm not trying to replace anything." "And you haven't," Zeke said gently. "You filled a place that was empty, and I didn't know was still waiting for you." The silence between them was deep, not uncomfortable, sacred. Zeke pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. He untied the cord and revealed a simple, worn silver ring. "I don't have much to offer you. This land is harsh, the future uncertain. But I promise you this. You'll never be alone here. Your children will be mine. Your language, your story, your name will have a place in this home. Not as a worker, not as a guest." He turned to her. "Would you stay, not as help, but as my wife?" Ada didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But something inside her came undone, something that had been held in too long. She touched the ring with her fingers, then Zeke's hand. "I didn't come here looking for love. I came fleeing emptiness. But here, with your children, with mine, love found me." Zeke slipped the ring onto her finger with clumsy hands. She kissed his cheek, slow, like someone giving thanks for a gift they never asked for, but surely earned. The children watched through the window. Kaya was the first to burst out. "You're getting married?" she shouted. "Really?" "Yes," Ada replied. "We're getting married." That night, while they all sat at dinner, Jace declared he wanted to be the one to carry flowers at the ceremony. Lila said she would weave a special ribbon for Ada's hair. Even Eli clapped his hands without understanding, simply because everyone else was smiling. Zeke looked at each of them, one by one, and finally realized that what they had wasn't just a family. It was destiny. And for the first time in many years, he wasn't afraid of the future, because he knew, no matter what came, she would be there. Not as a shadow, not as a guest, but as his partner. The wedding wasn't announced with bells or fancy invitations. There were no expensive flowers or imported gowns. It was a clear morning, with the sun rising slow over the hills, as if it too wanted to watch. Ada Redhawk prepared in silence. Lila braided her hair with a simple ribbon she had woven over the past few weeks. Kaya tucked small wildflowers into the braids, her hands careful and serious, as if she understood the importance of the moment. Eli watched everything with wide eyes, clinging to the edge of his mother's skirt. Zeke Callahan stood waiting in front of the house, holding his hat to his chest. He wasn't dressed in anything new, just his cleanest shirt, his boots brushed well, and the look of a man who no longer feared the future. Around him, the ranch seemed different. Not bigger, not richer, but more alive. A few neighbors came, one by one. Not everyone. But those who showed up did so without mockery or judgment. Clara Vance brought a bouquet of wildflowers. Judd Sloan helped string a line to hang small white handkerchiefs. Even Roy Cutter took off his hat respectfully when Ada stepped out onto the porch. There were no long speeches, just honest words. "I don't promise an easy life," Zeke said, voice steady. "I promise an honest one. I promise this home will be your shelter, and that you'll never walk alone again." Ada looked at him, her eyes filled with deep calm. "I don't promise to forget the pain we've known," she answered. "I promise to transform it. I promise to care for this home, these children, and this love, even when the wind blows against us." When they took each other's hands, there were no loud cheers. Just a respectful silence, the kind that feels heavy because it's full of meaning. After that, life continued. And that was the most beautiful part. Days turned into weeks. The dining table grew longer. Benches were added. So were the laughs. Kaya helped Ada in the kitchen. Lila learned words in the Apache language and taught Ada old songs her mother once sang. Jace and Eli grew like brothers who never wondered why they shared the same roof. One evening, as the sun dropped slow behind the fields, Zeke watched the children running wild through the grass. He sat beside Ada on the porch. "I never imagined this," he said. "I thought my story ended when I lost Sarah." Ada leaned her head against his shoulder. "Stories don't end when they break," she said softly. "Sometimes they start over, in a different shape." That night dinner was simple. Cornbread, hot soup, stewed meat. Nothing special to the outside world. Everything to them. Eli was the first to speak, mouth still full. "There's a lot of us," Zeke smiled. "There's 6. Kaya counted on her fingers, nodded, satisfied. "6 is a good number," she said. "No one gets left behind." Ada looked at the table. 6 plates, 6 hearts, 6 stories that had, somehow, found the same road. Outside, the wind crossed the field, moving the grass like a silent sea. Copper Springs was still a hard place. The world hadn't fully changed. There would still be glances, still be half-whispered words. But inside that house, something had shifted. They had learned that family isn't born just from blood. It's born from hard choices. From staying when leaving would be easier. From opening the door when the rest of the world slams it shut. Before going inside, Zeke paused and looked up at the star-filled sky. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked quietly. Ada looked at him, then turned toward the house, where the children laughed, unaware anyone had ever turned them away. "I think we did what was necessary," she said, "and sometimes that matters more than being right." Zeke nodded. The door closed gently behind them, and as night fell over the Callahan ranch, a question remained in the air. Not just for them, but for anyone hearing this story. If you ever had to choose between belonging to a place or building one with your own hands, which would you choose? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in discovering more real tales from the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more across this untamed land. Thank you.